Now let's talk about the one game console that everybody enjoyed. The one home video game console franchise that really defied classic back in the 70s and 80s. The Atari franchise. Now the Atari, just like some of the other game consoles I mentioned back in the 70s, started out by basically having what was known as its plug-in games. It had a couple of Pong games. It had its Pong game. It was best known for its Pong, Atari Pong, which came out in the early to mid-70s. It was known for its Stunt Cycle, which came out in the 70s, and I think early 80s. It was known for its Super Pong, which was a sequel to Pong itself. And in this case, you'll probably either see them on the side or probably in front of me as I'm talking about it. But it might be best known for its one system. And that's the 2600. Oh, and before I get into the 2600, I do have to mention the pinball machine, or the pinball system they made as well. But again, let's get into the one that really put Atari on the map, the 2600. Talk about a system that defied classic, ladies and gentlemen. This became one of the best-known video game consoles of all time back in the 80s, late 70s, and throughout the early to mid-80s. Why? Because it gave you the feel of not just interchangeable cartridges of different games, and based on different things, but it gave you the actual feel of a joystick at the arcade. Sure, it had one little button, but it gave you that option. Another thing that it gave you was you could switch your controllers out for different ones. Now, like I mentioned, it started out with its Pong system, right? So what better way to kind of integrate that into the 2600 but by giving you Pong controllers. That's right, little Pong controllers. They were mainly used for tennis, golf, sporting games, and even a Pong game itself on the 2600. Now, the Atari 2600 also introduced, for a short time, I don't know when they did this, but for a short time they even gave you wireless control. That's right, they sold the joystick in a bulk. They kind of bulked up the Atari joystick, if you will, put an antenna on it, and I guess you had to have some kind of connection or something to your ports, and you were able to play wirelessly, like from across the room. You were able to play without having to sit down or anything. So that was one of the reasons Atari 2600 is known as probably the best game console of all time. Now, of course, it did disappear. Now, of course, it stayed around even when Atari tried to up the ante a little bit. See, Atari tried to up the ante a few years later. When it introduced the 5200. However, the 5200 didn't last very long. Why? Because the 5200 had the same faults that the Coleco and the Mattel version had. It had a numeric, I'm not kidding about this, a numeric control stick. That's right, a numeric one. The other thing that made it different was the fact that when you tried to connect it, something was missing. That's right. Instead of your RF kind of connection that allowed you to switch from television to game, instead it was replaced by something different. Some kind of cable connection that not only you had to plug the game system in, but the AC adapter as well. But apparently they did fix this later on. But again, it didn't last very long. And when you tried to find third-party controllers, some of them didn't fit into the ports, which really pissed a lot of people off. Now, the 2600 did still survive. As a matter of fact, it redesigned itself and called itself the Atari 2600 Junior, thus making it more portable and more affordable. But Atari was not about to be outdone. No. Atari decided that they needed one last opportunity in the 80s to prove we're still going to be the dominant brand. And how did they prove that? They proved it with this. The 7800, which was one of the very first game consoles that allowed you to have backward capability. That's right. You were able to play not only the 7800 games, but you're also able to play your 2600 games. And just like with the 2600, you were able to switch its controllers. So in case you didn't want to use the controllers that look like a Nintendo controller, or the controllers that look like a better version of the ones you saw in the 5200, you could switch them out with the Atari 2600 controllers or the Sega ones, which was kind of cool. Now, unfortunately, the 7800 didn't last too much longer. It didn't last very long. I mean, it did have success, but it did not last. And Atari had to wait for a while. They had to wait until the 90s. That's right, the 90s, 1993 to be exact, to finally get one last opportunity to prove to the world that they are the dominant brand, that they're the ones that put video game consoles on the map, and that they're going to remain the dominant brand. And how did they do this? They did it by introducing the one system that many have considered, including the video game nerd himself, have considered a rare species. And that is this one, the Atari Jaguar. That's right, the Atari Jaguar came out in 1993 and was advertised as 64 bits. But as a matter of fact, it really wasn't 64 bits. Some games were, but most games were in between 16-bit and 64-bit. So a lot of people debate that even today, if the Jaguar was nothing more than Atari's way of saying, hey, we got a better system, come this way. I don't know. But even though people still debated and argued the fact that the graphics weren't that good, Atari still wouldn't give up. They had one last-ditch effort. They added on a CD-ROM. That's right, a CD add-on was put onto the game console itself. Basically what you did, and if you've seen Video Game Nerd's review on it this year, basically you had a CD add-on which you connected into the port, into the cartridge slot. You plugged it in with its own AC adapter and, audio video cables as well, and then you popped in your game. The only problem with this, though, was that, from what many have said, and even nerds had problem doing this, the disc would not work. Well, what the disc would work, but the CD thing, the CD-ROM wouldn't work. I mean, that's weird. I mean, even the nerd sent it to someone that has a specialty in fixing these things, and it wouldn't work for him either. That was the one problem that Atari had with its last-ditch effort at video games. It tried its best. It tried its best to put itself on the map with the Jaguar, but it failed because even though the Jaguar was an okay system, the CD-ROM didn't help it much. And when adding it on, all you did was make it look like a damn shitter, or in this case, a toilet. Sorry about the language. But despite all that, Atari was also part of something that took place in the 80s. And I mentioned this in my previous video. What happened was basically the video game crash of '83. And it would take 2 years before two systems would come to the rescue. Nintendo and Sega. And I'll get into those next.